Today we have the brand new Rocky Mountain Altitude, and oh boy, is it special.
Hey, stand up guy on 10 toes. Big body pull up in a Range Rover. I can change the whole game when I say so. I pull up, shut it down, yeah, they know. Running this game ain't a thing for me. I never switched up, no change. I know we make it look easy. I know.
This is a bit of a new look for Rocky with a reincarnated LC2R suspension design, which is their version of a floating pivot. And that does become the standout feature on this bike. It promises the same or better small bump sensitivity that Rocky is famous for, very little chain interaction on the suspension so you don't get pedal kickback, promises a lot of mid-stroke and end-stroke support for an overall really nice ride quality. And it cashes basically every one of those checks. And we also have a cool new feature that Rocky put on the Instinct. It is also on the new Altitude. It is the Reach Adjust headset cups. So with these adjustable head cups, you have a neutral setting, you've got a +5 mil, and a -5 millimeter setting. I typically fall somewhere around here on the shorter end of an extra large frame. Every once in a while, I'll hop on a large, and that's what I did with this Altitude, because we can now add a little bit of reach and get me in a place where I'm a bit more comfortable. So essentially what you can do with these headset cups is now minimize this gap between the sizes. So my large can now fit maybe a little bit closer there, or I could potentially be on an XL and bring the fit down here somewhere. And this gap can get as small as 12 millimeters on the Altitude. For reference, most brands have a 20 to 25 millimeter gap between sizes. Oh, and before we go, we've got one more cool feature about the Altitude, and it's the same as was on the Instinct, and it has been dubbed by one YouTube commenter as literally the stupidest thing I have ever seen. And it is the AirTag holder inside the frame storage cover, which honestly I think is a really nice touch for an added measure of security. I'm not going to beat around the bush. Let's talk about the Altitude on the climbs. It is definitely not going to win the most energetic climber award. It's big, it's heavy, the suspension was clearly made for downhill performance. I don't think this bike makes any compromises in the name of uphill performance. It's all about the downhill. I think we'd be mad if that was the case. You're not buying a 160 mil travel bike for the way it climbs. Diving in, I think the previous Altitude towed that line between all mountain and enduro bikes. The 2024 Altitude does no such thing. It plants itself squarely in the enduro category. It leaves no question or doubt. The suspension is rather active, meaning there is some pedal bob and inefficiency. The best way to describe it is there's very little encouragement from the bike to pedal faster or to stand up and sprint or to give it the beans. Instead, the Altitude tries to tell you to chill, turn Strava off, you'll get there when you get there, but you will get there. And frankly, I'm not too upset about that because that meets my fitness goals anyway. There is a positive hidden in all of that though, and it is in the amount of traction and comfort and control you get out of that active suspension on the climbs. There is essentially an endless amount of traction available on the Altitude. You could stand up on the loosest, grossest, nastiest, graveliest bit of climb, and you're probably still not going to slip out. And it's certainly very helpful on those steep climbs where you have to stand up and give it the berries. This bike will stick to the ground for you so that you can give it all you got. And that does help the Altitude be a little bit better technical climber. At the end of the day, I still don't think it's a great technical climber because you've got the size, the weight, the slack geometry, other things holding it back, but it does at least have the traction and control component of being a good technical climber. So the bike's overall weight also is a factor on the climbs. Out of the box, it's 36.5 pounds. It's not a light bike. But about that, this bike is built ready to ride. A lot of manufacturers will throw paper-thin tires on their big, gnarly enduro bikes in an effort to maybe make that weight appear a little bit better. But in all reality, after that first ride, you're swapping out those lightweight casing tires for something proper anyway. So why? And I guess, to the manufacturer's credit, the weight weaning market demands it. I don't know why people care so much, but they seem to care even on a bike like this. To Rocky's credit, they don't mess around. They're not playing games. This bike comes with a double down rear tire, an XO Plus front tire, Cush Core Light in both of those tires. So out of the box, it's ready to ride. You're not going to need to put new tires on it tomorrow. Now let's get to the good part, the downhill, and damn, this part's pretty good. I'm not trying to fanboy, but it's a little bit difficult not to in this case. The suspension is some of the best I have ever ridden. All right, here we go. Close your eyes, picture a big enduro bike plowing through some really nasty terrain. The suspension is dialed and the bike is just eating up every little bump and every big bump. All you hear is the pitter-patter of tires contouring the ground perfectly over rocks and roots and all sorts of gross terrain. And that is exactly how the altitude feels. It is exactly like you just pictured. The altitude has a way of making terrain almost completely disappear. If the bump is head height or smaller, you're probably not going to feel it. While that is a bit of an exaggeration, the altitude is the bike equivalent of the magic eraser. It erases terrain and mistakes. So your line choice becomes a little less important. Keep the bars mostly straight, front wheel mostly pointed downhill, you're probably going to be just fine. The way the wheels stick to the ground and contour the terrain just provides an endless amount of traction. And that traction is especially noticeable on steeps, off cambers, and flat corners. So if you heard all of that and started cringing, thinking that the altitude is boring and makes it too easy, kind of does make things too easy. Just go faster, ride harder, hit bigger features, and you're going to have a hell of a time on the altitude. It also has a way of not feeling like it's too much bike. And that's maybe a little crazy to say, that a bike with suspension that contours the ground so well can also be somewhat lively and fun and engaging to ride, but this somehow accomplishes that. And I think it's the mid-stroke support from this suspension design. You've got something to pump against. You've got something that'll allow you to pump and jump and corner and not just feel like you're on a dead waterbed. It reminds me a little bit of the Santa Cruz Mega Tower V2. That bike also is very plush, also is very controlled and smooth, yet lively and fun to ride. Altitude is very similar, maybe just shifted up a couple points on the Burley scale. One little caveat here, I'm on a coil spring and the spring rate is 450. I ran a couple of spring rate calculators and I should probably be in the 450 to 475 range. So I could potentially be a tiny bit undersprung or running a little more sag than I normally would. That said, I didn't encounter any like mid-stroke wallow or any bottom out issues on this. So even given the opportunity, I'd probably still keep it at 450 because I love how this bike contours the ground, how much traction it offers. I love the small bump sensitivity, and I'm not experiencing any negative effects from running a bit more sag, apart from maybe climbing performance, but I don't care about that. That said, I would still like to put a 500-pound spring on this thing and see how it changes the ride quality. And talking about handling, it's basically what you'd expect from a big bike. It leans more towards the stable side of things than it does the quick, snappy, lively, fun side of things. And even with the shorter wheelbase than I'm used to, remember I dropped down to a large but added 5 mils of reach, it still is on the stable side of things. It's not a quick and zippy little trail bike. It's much happier going mock chicken in gross, nasty terrain. That said, it does corner just fine. There's a ton of traction, so you can hit corners at speed. It just prefers maybe a little bit wider radius. Luckily, it does not care if that corner is smooth and bermed and fast, or if it's loose, gross, rubbly, and flat. It'll hook up in either one. All right, couple of comparisons here. We've talked about one of them, Santa Cruz Mega Tower V2, so let's dive in. Altitude used to sit on maybe the all-mountain side of the Mega Tower, and I now think the new one has leapfrogged the Mega, and it is clearly a step burlier than the Mega Tower. The Mega will win on the climbs and maybe the uphill, downhill balance, making it slightly more versatile than the Altitude, but the Altitude does win in descending capability. It feels deeper, plusher, and gooier than the Mega. Next up, we've got the... I'm really excited to dive more into that exact showdown. Now we've got the Altitude versus the Instinct. Rocky recently updated the Instinct a couple of weeks ago, and that bike also got a big upgrade in downhill performance. And some might even argue that it looks more like an enduro bike than it does a trail bike. I'd understand that if you had only seen the bike on paper. If you've ridden it, you'd know that's probably not actually the case. It is still a trail bike, just a very capable trail bike. The previous Instinct and Altitude were very similar, maybe too similar. There's quite a bit of overlap between them. They shared a frame, so it was largely build and a shock that made up the difference between the two. And even though the Instinct got a capability upgrade, the Altitude got one and maybe an even bigger one. So it is clearly in a different category than the Instinct. So the Instinct is more lively, more fun, has sharper handling, is better on the climbs, is more fun to jump. It is certainly less capable. The Altitude definitely wins the capability cake. It is faster, gnarlier, burlier, bigger in every single way. So who is the Altitude for? There is no hiding the fact that this is a gravity lover's bike. It is not a climber's bike. That said, it is still surprisingly fun, even in the traditional sense of cornering, jumping, goofing around. So I think it's It's really good for anybody who lives for the descents, regardless of rider style maybe. It's definitely not a bike I'd recommend to anybody who lives for the climbs. So if you've ever made a Strava and tried to get a comm on a climb, I don't think this is going to be your jam. If you live for the descents and you're willing to put up the necessary evil of climbing to get to the good stuff, I don't know if you'll find a better option than the altitude. So if you spend a lot of time shuttling, chairlifting, or if you don't mind a little extra effort on the ups to reward yourself with the best possible descender, then snag one of these. You won't be disappointed. Thanks for sticking around. See you next time.